The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that we're marking Small Business Week, this government's policies are actually hurting Canada's 1 million small businesses. So shops near the border, hotels near national parks, tourism operators across the country are hurting. And those Conservative members who have small business in their constituencies know that. And it is this government's damaging policies and tax increases that are hurting small business. So when will they take...
Order. Order. We're almost through the list. Order. The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra still has a few seconds, and I'd like to hear the question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, their constituents in small business are not laughing at these policies. And when will this government make sure that their policies support rather than undermine small business?
The Honourable Minister of State.
Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. This is the Conservative government who has lowered every tax we can imagine, including taxes for small businesses across this country. This government supports small, medium-sized, as well as multinational organizations. If anybody here wants to raise taxes, it would be A, the Liberals, who have a history of it, and B, the NDP, who are promising to do it should they ever receive
The honourable member for Rivière.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have a chance to speak on this Liberal motion on omnibus bills today and why there should be a committee to review and report on how they may properly be used. Now, omnibus bills are intended to be a tool for matters of housekeeping and efficiency, for grouping minor and uncontroversial updates into one place. They have a role. I've used omnibus bills myself as a minister, used them as they are intended to be used. They are intended, in fact, to facilitate parliamentary debate by bringing together all the minor technical and administrative amendments to legislation that arise from a single policy decision. And that's the critical part, Mr. Speaker, and how far this Parliament and this Prime Minister have strayed. I won't pretend that the phenomenon of abusive omnibus bills being used to bundle major and consequential change of numerous policy decisions is a new one. But I will contend that under this government it has become an unparalleled expression of contempt for Canadians and a tool for the dismantling of a core principle of our democracy, the principle of Parliament's accountability to constituents. Under another government in 2005, the budget bill was 120 pages long, and it was at the time a record length. And the opposition leader of the day, now the Right Honourable Prime Minister, asked, and I quote, "How can members represent their constituents on these various areas when they are forced to vote on a block of such legislation?" Exactly, I would say. He denounced omnibus bills as undemocratic and, I quote, "a contradiction to the conventions and practices of this House." Mr. Speaker, exactly so. So I would ask the today's Prime Minister regarding his omnibus bill C-38 last spring, where is his integrity? If his words of 2005 indeed expressed his convictions, I would ask what happened to his convictions. Members were forced last June to vote on a block of legislation 4 times the length and 4,000 times the impact on Canadians compared with the omnibus bill that he so decried in 2005. And I would ask also, why did he do that? And why is he preparing another such travesty of an omnibus bill that we are expecting to be presented this fall? Mr. Speaker, why is this tactic so wrong, this misuse of omnibus bills? Because it does not allow parliamentarians to do their job for the people we represent. Let's just look at C-38 for a moment. 452 pages long, 753 clauses, and 70 different acts amended. It is first and foremost an abuse of democracy to lump together such an array of massive policy change. And in the case of Bill C-38, permit me to list just a few examples. C-38 increases government's power over people's lives in many domains such as immigration, access to employment insurance, pensions, and industrial development in people's backyards, to name just a few. And as C-38 increases ministers' individual powers over individual people's lives, it reduces the very accountability mechanisms that make sure these powers are not being abused. Scary stuff indeed. The breadth of policy change in C-38 is breathtaking. The changes to the very fabric of financial security for seniors, changes that are fundamental injustice to Canada's immigration intake process, changes to our critical environmental safety net. And to add insult to injury, C-38 gave Revenue Canada $8 million a year in extra money to intimidate and punish environmental and other not-for-profit organizations that dared to speak up for the public interest. How many Canadians wanted that? How many Canadians thought they were voting for that? That's 10 times the dollars that this government claims it will be saving by eliminating a Coast Guard search and rescue base in the heart of the busiest harbour in Canada, that in the Kitsilano Coast Guard base. And many of my constituents, every one that I've heard from, is angry at the closure of that base because they know it will lead to preventable deaths. So Bill C-38 was an attack on democracy, an attack on the environment, and an attack on Canadian values and Canadian people. To lump these fundamental rewrites of policy and practice into a single bill that cannot be properly examined, understood, debated, communicated, nor amended is an abuse of democratic principles, and that abuse of democracy must end. And you know, the Prime Minister used to agree with me on this, but that was then, and this is now. And I would contend that this government's reliance on omnibus budget bills is a symptom of an underlying condition, the condition of contempt. And this has been amply proven. This government has a contempt for democracy, a contempt for Parliament, it's contempt for the rule of the law, it has contempt for civil society, and contempt for Canadians. Canada is a country built on hard work, responsibility, freedom, equality, opportunity, compassion, and respect for one another. Deep liberal values, but also Canadian values. It's a country in which contempt by its leaders for its people has no place. With Canada's history of sacrifice in defense of democracy, we must never forget that Parliament is important. What we do here and how we do it matters. C'est la voix canadienne.
It's the Canadian way to have a healthy democracy. It's the Canadian way to have a government that's responsible for its actions and decisions. It's the Canadian way to have transparent processes and procedures. It's the Canadian way to have a government that gives its citizens the opportunity to get involved in political life and to participate in the making of decisions that concern them. But on the contrary, omnibus bills are an attack on democracy. They are an attack on the political traditions of Canada and on the rights of citizens. The problem with these omnibus bills is at the constitutional level, because the legal borders here are not clear. It's also a political problem, but there are solutions. I know it's a huge task that awaits us. A committee would be just the first step.
So the committee must do its work, but that is just the first step. The committee must find out how this kind of abuse is prevented in other Western liberal democracies. It must propose changes to tighten up the latitude that exists for abusing omnibus bills and apply accountability which does not exist today. And we must ask ourselves this question. Is there not something fundamentally wrong with an electoral system, Canada's electoral system, in which 25% of eligible voters can provide a governing party with a majority, a government which can then proceed to make these kinds of major policy changes we saw in C-38 with no due process, without respect, with contempt, and with impunity? I can picture a day when our electoral system will strengthen democratic accountability and not weaken it. I can picture a day when the proportion of each party's public representatives in this place will more closely reflect the will of the voters. And I can picture this renewed Canadian democracy creating the incentive for parliamentarians to really work together across party lines on the big challenges of the day. It's time to have that conversation with Canadians. How we elect our parliament, how we govern ourselves, how we include and consult, how we write and debate our legislation says something important about Canada and the kind of people Canadians want to be. And this government's abuse of omnibus bills represents secrecy, contempt, exclusion, and meanness. That's not Canada. That's not who Canadians are. And that means this abuse of power must be fixed. And we can start right now by voting in favor of the Liberal motion to end the misuse of omnibus legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question and commentaire, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank the Liberal member once again for raising everything odious and anti-democratic in the omnibus bill tabled by the Conservatives, and the next one that is to be tabled later this week, which is even more massive and voluminous and probably even more controversial. So what springs to my mind is that between 1993 and 2006, the Liberals tabled 14 omnibus bills, once a year. So today they're rising to denounce that practice. I imagine they've recognized that that was anti-democratic. What means that it's worse today than it was when they were in power?
Vancouver Quadra.
I wish to thank my colleague from the NDP for her question. I have commented before that there were omnibus bills during that time, but they were much, much shorter. There was less at stake politically. There were no controversial issues in them. What we're seeing now is an abuse of the process. The time has come to stop this.
Questions and comments, Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Canso.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, just to start, I want to caution my colleague in the NDP and from Mercier, don't be sucked in to listen to the talking points of the government. We're talking apples and oranges, 21-page budgets versus 400-page budgets. So don't fall for that stuff. I want to ask my colleague what aspects of the budget would have benefited from a full and thorough investigation by committees. When I look at the fact that they have a piece of legislation coming to Human Resources Committee now, Bill C-44, that will impact on about 6,000 Canadians. It received unanimous consent of the House, unanimous support in the House, but that's going to committee for full hearings and witnesses and testimony and hearings through the committee. However, you know, something like working while on claims, which they've just made a mess of, which impacts on 900,000 Canadians, gets flushed through in this omnibus bill. So I ask her, what other aspects, because they've royally jigged up working while on claim, what other aspects of the bill just sort of spring to mind that may have been tweaked a little bit had they had the opportunity to come to committee?
The Honourable Member for Vancouver Quadra.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my colleague for that question, and of course one that springs immediately to mind for a British Columbian and indeed for any Canadian that wants to have a strong economy that actually protects and restores the environment, not degrades the environment. The one that comes to mind is the changes to the Environmental Assessment Act. There we saw a massive, massive erasing of 30 years' worth of development of thoughtful process to assess the potential impacts of development. And to not only to assess, but to provide direction to how that development can take place in a way that does not impact the environment. So this was very useful kind of public policy that has just been undermined completely. 3,000 environmental assessments a year that will not be taking place that used to take place. And Mr. Speaker, I do want to add the comment that that is bad for business, because we see what happens when an industry does not have the trust of the public thanks to the intervention by that government that undermines their trust, undermines the trust of the public in the protection of the environment with the kind of measures that Bill C-38 highlighted.
Resuming debate.
Question come on top.
Questions and comments?
Comments. The honourable member for Etobicoke. Nope. For Vancouver Quadra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And one of the concerns that I've heard about the Omnibus bill program of the Conservative government is that it contributes to an apathy about our political process. And we know that that's a symptom of democratic decline in Canada, especially young people who choose not to vote. And so I'd like my colleague to comment on youth and how to engage them, and how this motion might help with that.
The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague from Vancouver Quadra, I thank her. One of the things that we do not do in this House is we have a trouble engaging in a much larger conversation. The larger conversation, including the seniors, including other parts, our communities, whether it be ethnic communities within the city, rural communities outside of urban centres, and certainly the other community I speak of would be the youth. The problem becomes if we put all of this into one bill and vote it on very quickly, because it's handled so quickly, none of the issues that are important to Canadians become a tangible issue. To be a tangible issue is to put it into a forum where we can actually discuss ways of doing this. The changes to employment insurance, big changes coming to those in youth. And here's what I mean by that. If you have a job that is, filling the gap, and all of a sudden you're laid off, you're on unemployment insurance, you would like to get experience in things that will give you a better job in the future. But if it's a disincentive for you financially to do that, you're not going to. This is the tangibility that the government is not giving us in what we would consider to be a respected debate.
Reprise de débat.